Something which we have talked about, quite a bit on the program, the euthanasia legislation in New Zealand. It is up for review. Of course, we were talking earlier in the week with Tanya Unkovich about her palliative care bill that she's putting forward. And it's actually coming up to the anniversary of the End of Life Choice Act being enacted. That happened on the 7th of November last year. Somebody who is, very much an advocate in this space is Brendan Malone. He is the director of LifeNet. Joins us on the program now. Brendan, kia ora, thanks for your time.
Great to be here, Andrew. Thanks for having me once again.
So it is the 1 year anniversary coming up. You and I have talked about the review process, but first up, just wanting to talk about a bit of a grisly development in this legislation. The review process is happening, but this is, a change in the regulations which has kind of been sneaked under the radar?
Yeah, literally about 2 weeks ago or so, earlier this month in October, Organ Donation New Zealand just quietly made an announcement on their website. They posted a very short, brief little statement saying that they would now be accepting organ donations from euthanasia and assisted suicide patients. And the statement itself is even a little bit fraught because it says that they haven't even finished the final sort of review process of their, framework and policy with the Ministry of Health and with the National Ethics Committee, yet they've already received organ donations from assisted suicide and euthanasia patients. So this is a really fraught process. A lot of papers have been written overseas about this particular issue because it creates this whole new point of potential coercion where someone feels, well, maybe my life's not worth living, but I can actually make it worthwhile by ending my life and becoming an organ donor. And then the pressure starts to come on as well. You've now got a group of medical professionals who are now involved in the process, but their primary concern is not really the patient. Instead, their primary concern is harvesting organs for other recipients. So the whole thing is very, very fraught, and it's just quietly started happening with no no oversight from Parliament or even public consultation at all.
There's been no legislative changes, but this step has happened. And some people may be thinking, well, surely this is happening through the consent of the person. This is, maybe they're listed as an organ donor. This is what they're wanting to do. But the point that you make is that this really ups the ante when it comes to coercion. Somebody who is perhaps struggling with a terminal disease, that may be the tipping point for them to go, hey, but if my organs could save a life, yes, I'll sign the document. I'll end my life now.
Yeah, and it's also just there's a whole lot of really big complications with this because the most ideal conditions for retrieving donor organs are when the death is reasonably foreseeable and controllable.
Yeah.
And so this creates almost a perfect storm, an ideal situation where the focus becomes about getting the organs. And it creates these interesting questions like, what happens if a patient wants to go a certain route with their treatment, but the organ retrieval team say, well, that wouldn't be in our best interests. We think that you should do this instead because it will help us get the organs better. There's all these very serious ethical issues associated with this. And as I said, ethics papers have been written about this overseas, highlighting this. And here we are. It's just quietly started happening. There was no parliamentary conversation, no public debate about this. A group of policy experts just got together and said, well, let's just start doing this. So that's a form of expansion, effectively, that no one ever really had any say in. And
ironically, it's taking part of the choice out of the end-of-life choice process. When it comes to, I suppose, what is happening internationally, now you referred to that beforehand, because as we approach the 1 year anniversary, there was talk in the build-up to the referendum and a lot of concern about where this will go once the legislation is enacted, where things will go a few years down the track. We're coming up to the 1 year anniversary, perhaps a useful point to compare what has happened in other countries that have gone through a similar legislative process. What does it look like? What does euthanasia look like in those countries a few years down the track?
Well, I guess the one big example that's being discussed right now, and interestingly enough, this has become a bit of a global conversation again, because right now the United Kingdom is actually debating a possible euthanasia bill themselves. And so people are focused in particular, upon the nation of Canada.
Yeah.
And Canada has become like an international siren song, a warning about what can happen, because you effectively people even within Canada now are starting to say, look, euthanasia is out of control here.
Yeah.
They're on the verge of legalizing euthanasia for people who have mental illness. That's the sole condition.
Yeah.
No terminal conditions of any sort of physical nature, simply mental illness. And they've had cases of people who are being euthanized because they're not getting the state care that they need. For example, people with certain disabilities who can't get access to benefits, and they're choosing euthanasia instead because they can't get, for example, housing accommodation supplements and things like this. So there's some real problems there. In fact, I was reading an op-ed piece just the other day from an Irish journalist who said, look, I am actually in principle pro-euthanasia, but I've now changed my mind after looking at what's happening in Canada. And it's really got out of control. And why I talk about Canada is because for a long time, New Zealand has been referred to as the Canada of the Pacific. We have a very similar sort of approach to sort of society and governance. Even though there are some big differences, there are some similarities. And so obviously that's something that we should look to, I think, with a little bit of concern.
With the legislation here in New Zealand, though, comparing Canada's original legislation, now there have been changes and amendments and things have been loosened up since it was originally put into place. But how does New Zealand's legislation compare to Canada at the moment, Brendan?
Well, ours obviously is a lot. Initially, certainly it started this way anyway. Ours is tighter than theirs, but it's far from ideal here in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And as you've already said, Canada quickly shifted. It did not take long for them to remove clauses like that. The death had to be like reasonably foreseeable, like your death had to be imminent. That was one of the first things that quickly got removed. And now they're on this pathway of expansion. It really is, and I don't think it's an understatement to say this, it really is out of control in Canada. In fact, there's a case that's happening right now that's going through the courts in British Columbia there, where a judge has just put a stay on a euthanasia case that was approved, and the judge has said, hold on, I'm not comfortable with this at all, because someone went to one group of doctors and they said, no, you don't qualify. So the same patient journeyed to someone who has now become quite an infamous and well-known euthanasia doctor.
Yeah.
They went to this other female euthanasia doctor, and she said, "Okay, I'll approve it."
Yeah.
And this is it's become a mess now. That's very quickly happened. Now, in New Zealand, we are a bit further back down the track from that. We've been practicing euthanasia now in our country for 3 years, and so we are further back. But already there are some serious issues. And one of those issues is around reporting, which has come to light through some New Zealand Herald coverage recently, that in actual fact, the Reporting and Oversight Committee hasn't even been meeting for a lengthy period.
Yeah.
And there were death reports that weren't even being looked at.
If we compare the current legislation in New Zealand, though, to what Canada originally had back in the day, was Canada's legislation always more liberal than what we have in New Zealand, or did they start out in a similar place to where we are now, but have quickly liberalised? Is this the canary in the coal mine to where we may be heading?
I think it's similar. There is one big difference that they had in Canada that we don't have here, and I think it's something that a lot of medical staff are really fighting for, and to keep hold of here in New Zealand, is that in New Zealand, a doctor is not allowed to suggest it to a patient.
Yeah.
They are not allowed to say, hey, have you thought about euthanasia? In New Zealand, the patient has to request it. It seems highly likely that that possible clause in the law is already being violated, I suspect behind closed doors, because it would be very hard to monitor that.
Yeah.
But in practice, anyway, it seems to be generally being upheld to that the doctor's not allowed to suggest it to a patient. Now, in Canada, doctors right from the very get-go were allowed to suggest it to patients. And I've actually spoken to quite a few doctors, and they say that that one clause alone has been quite pivotal, they think, in what's gone on in Canada. It's not the only reason, but it certainly seems to have been a pivotal factor, because it's not just doctors suggesting it to vulnerable patients. And think about this, you're a vulnerable patient.
Yep.
Who is the doctor to you in your life at that moment? They are everything. They are the rock you go to for all of your health advice. And if they're suggesting a course of action, that can be a very powerful influencing factor. But it's also doctors who there's been famous cases of them approaching family members and saying, hey, have you thought about this for your mother or your daughter?
Yeah.
And in scenarios like this, they're not even talking to the patient, they're talking to family members directly. So that one factor has been quite a radical difference. And there are medical professionals here in New Zealand who are saying we cannot lose that legal restriction that says that doctors are not allowed to advise and bring it up with patients.
Although this may be already chipped away with the organ donation policy, which has already been enacted, that, I mean, certainly putting a lot more pressure if you have a part of the medical fraternity that are looking for life-saving organs, then it's more likely that conversations will be initiated by medical staff.
Well, exactly. And I think this was always one of the things. The lawyers who opposed this here in New Zealand, who opposed the law, said that one clause was always probably going to be one of the quickest to actually fall over. Because how can you create something that you are calling a legitimate legalized medical therapy and then gag doctors and say they're not allowed to advise a patient of their legitimate, what is quote unquote, a legitimate medical therapy option? And so it's potentially just a court case away where someone says, well, I wasn't advised of all my options, or my mother or my father, they weren't advised. This is a violation of my healthcare rights. And so that would fall over at that point. But you're right. Once you start getting the organ donor thing in, and this is another factor, I suspect what will happen is, because the most ideal situation to retrieve organs is under a very controlled and known death, which normally is not the case. You don't know that someone's going to die, but in this case, you will be able to plan for it. Then I suspect there will become an incentive within the system to say, we need to actually start bringing up organ donation with potential euthanasia patients as well. It sort of incentivizes both and, if you like.
Is organ donation part of the system in Canada, do you know?
I'm not entirely sure what's happening in Canada in that regard. I probably should have double-checked that before coming on air with you, but I'm not entirely sure. I do know there are 7 jurisdictions around the world, that, including New Zealand, that are actually doing this. So it is becoming a thing. And it's interesting, there's, as I said, just recently, another big ethics paper was written with raising several interesting concerns. Like, for example, with organ donation, the rule at the moment is you have to have a dead donor. The donor, you don't begin retrieving organs until the person is absolutely irreversibly dead. Well, that's now very blurry when the process of, it's not simply a patient dying, we are making the patient dead. And that changes everything in that regard.
And certainly, as you say, the psychological pressure, but with the situation in Canada at the moment, where you've got homeless people, you've got people with mental illness who are choosing euthanasia, and you can imagine the pressure if you had a mental illness and you had a close family member that was on dialysis, the psychological, the family pressure to, I'll make this sacrifice to support this loved one. It just takes it to an unbearable place. Brendan, thank you so much for the work that you do in this space. Thank you for your research. Thank you for your time on the program today.
Great to be here again, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.